I've always enjoyed the thought of ghosts and stuff, but never really believed firmly. I liked it just enough that it was entertaining, but not scary. So a friend of mine had this long-standing ghost story of the Bunny Man at her dad's house. A maybe 8-foot tall shadow figure with bunny ears or horns that she saw often in the woods by her dad's house as a child, and spoke enough about her dad and her sister teased her about it into adulthood. Her parents were separated, so she lived with her mom after the age of 10, and wasn't at her dad's house as often enough for this ghost story to really persist. A few incidents at sleepovers, but nothing big. When we were newly 20 years old, we moved back in with our parents to save some money and pay some bills. She and her mom didn't get along, so her dad gladly invited her to live with him in his house by the woods. She gladly accepted. Of course, her decision to move in brought up the Bunny Man, which we had a laugh about and moved on. I helped her move in because I owned a big car, and why not? Immediately sketchy things started to happen while we were moving in stuff. We would put things in places and 10 minutes later, they would be somewhere else. At some point, she put her purse inside while we were moving furniture, and we lost it. And we found it in my car. But whatever, explainable. But the more it happened, the more we began to kind of freak out. As we moved the last load of the night out of my car, it was dark. The outside lights, motion detected, flickered on and off while we were inside. We went back to my car, unsettled and ready to go back home and be done packing for the day. We get in and we turn on the lights. On my windshield, as plain as day, is a huge elongated handprint, as an angle as though someone was on top of my car when they pressed it. I can't stress to you how alone we were at the house. It's literally in the woods, far from anything. Her dad wasn't even home. He's a trucker and was gone for a few weeks while we moved in. We hadn't put the handprint there. Both of us froze, unable to speak. After a moment I reached up and touched it, and it came off. It was inside the windshield. I wiped it away and started to drive off, pretty spooked, but my friend started to straight up cry. She was a pretty stoic person. I think I have seen her cry maybe twice, and this was one of the times. She only lived there about 4 months in between houses, but it was a weird few months. If we start talking about the Bunny Man too long, something would happen. Lights would go off and turn on. Things would fall off shelves, and we would hear tapping on windows. If we were having a fire in the backyard, the fire would spark and pop. We never felt settled there. I'm amazed she slept there because the few nights I stayed in the guest bedroom, it was hard to sleep.
Just an overarching feeling of dread.
Very quiet part of the woods too, not a lot of bird sounds and not a lot of wildlife. Lots of weird shit happening in general, stuff going missing, stuff falling for no reason. And at some point, my boyfriend at the time, window was broken with no possible suspects. Our other friend swore in her life that she saw a shadow man in the woods one night, and from then on out needed to be walked to her car from the house. Anyway, no real big specific incidents, but enough accumulating things that we knew what it was, and we knew it was haunted. My old broke down car is still currently there, because I had no place really to store it. So in 2 weeks I get to go visit while I get my car towed. Maybe I'll have another Bunny Man experience.
In May 2009, I just broke up with my girlfriend of almost 3 years. We had moved from Calgary to Toronto and we're still living together because after the breakup we didn't really know many people in the city. Needless to say, the situation was relatively stressful and upsetting. So when a buddy of mine suggested a weekend camping trip full of fishing and hunting, I jumped to the chance. He grew up in an area about an hour outside of Toronto called Flamborough. It's really beautiful, loads of lush forests, farmers' fields and small rivers and creeks everywhere. We decided to camp along a fishing creek called Grindstone Creek. It was close to some wetlands and fishing is suggested to be great there. We ended up setting up our camp in what was probably a farmer's field, I'm guessing. We were probably trespassing on our part too, bordered by a gorgeous forest. We spent the evening fishing, shooting and drinking some quality beers. As it got darker, we made a little fire and roasted potatoes and hot dogs, and it was all in a really good night spirit. We really enjoyed the evening and decided to turn in around midnight. We shared a tent. My buddy fell asleep before me and I stayed up playing on my phone until around 1:30. I must have drifted off because the next thing I remembered was being woken up by a high-pitched yiping type sound. I was kind of groggy and it took me a moment to fully wake up. The yiking sound was really off-putting. It almost sounded like it was a weird coyote. I laid there for a moment listening and then started playing on my phone again. The noise was annoying as hell. I tried to ignore it, but it sounded like it was only getting closer. Finally, it sounded like it had to be no more than 10 feet from the tent. At this point I was getting a little unsettled. I'd seen coyotes in Calgary before and I thought they were pretty harmless. They never looked much bigger than a smallish dog, but what if this had rabies or something? What if it could smell our food? I have pretty bad anxiety, so I'm prone to worrying about these type things. I nudged my buddy to see if he was awake and he was. The noise also woken him. We discussed what we thought to do about the coyote, and we hadn't brought anything to scare off the critters, not even a BB gun, nothing. So we decided to shine the flashlight on it. Then if we hollered a lot, it would hopefully scare it off, right? So he unzipped the tent and I watched him pointing the flashlight out into the darkness. I'll never forget what happened next though. His legs suddenly went all wobbly and he sort of stumbled back into the tent. He had this really terrified, dumbfounded look on his face when he looked at me and dabbled, "It's not a coyote, it's a dude. It's some weird dude." Normally I would have thought that he was messing with me. I'm a huge wimp and get scared easily. I don't even watch horror movies. But I've never seen somebody look that scared before. And I never want to see that expression on somebody's face again. So I knew that he wasn't pulling my leg. These weird yiping and howling sounds continued, and they only seemed to be getting louder. In retrospect, it really didn't sound like it was a coyote, but I guess in our groggy states it was a pretty rational way of thinking of all of this. Anyways, he kept telling me to just look out of the tent flap to make sure it's not doing anything crazy. At this point, I was having a full-blown panic attack. My heart was racing. I felt terrible, but I had to look. I slowly peeked out of the flap and waited for my eyes to adjust to the darkness. That's when I saw him. He was standing only a few arms lengths away from the tent. He was swaying a little, wearing a baseball cap. What made it awful? He was just really creepy. He was wearing some woman's gear. That's when I knew that something was really off about this guy. If the making high-pitched noise at strangers wasn't scary enough to give that away anyway. After I pulled my head back inside the tent, my buddy and I discussed what to do. Finally, we decided to yell at this guy to go away. My buddy then started yelling, "Excuse me, can you go away? We're trying to sleep here." And the noise stopped. It was dead silent, and that's when we heard the footsteps running towards the tent. They stopped right outside our tent though, and didn't waste any time. We then started yelling, "Seriously, go away, we've got phones, and if you don't go, we're gonna call the cops." With that, we heard him walk by the tent and head off. It sounded like he was moving towards the road. Needless to say, we lay there awake, absolutely petrified until the first signs of sunlight. We then got the hell out of there. We discussed our experience on the way home, and we're both pretty embarrassed about how scared we got. But it definitely wasn't mainly on either of our parts. I think we are both ashamed of how we let some weirdo freak us out so much. But here's the thing, what if this had turned out differently? Sometimes I wonder what would have happened had we been a couple of girls. I'm not saying he was a serial killer, but who the hell goes around to people's tents like that making weird sounds? I guess I'll never know, and for that, I'm kind of glad. Camping Horror by Majoli. This happened to my parents back in the late 80s. They're in their mid-20s when all of this occurred. My parents decided to go camping in cool California. When they got there, it was kind of late. My mum was sitting down on a log while my dad was unpacking the truck. While sitting down, she heard walking around their campsite, so she went and quietly told my dad that she heard somebody walking around. They then got the hell out of there, just in case, and they decided to drive another 3 miles down the road with their headlights off, so that way it would be unlikely they could be followed. Once they got there, they set up camp and began drinking really heavily to a boxing match on the radio. Eventually, they settled in for the night. Now, they don't know for sure whether the next event is connected to the first, but they believe it is. So they settled in and my dad was asleep far before my mum. My mum was in the halfway there state where you're half awake and asleep. Suddenly, she heard footsteps outside the tent. She abruptly snapped back to consciousness and listened. She tried waking up my dad, but he was way too out of it. She listened then for what seemed like hours when she suddenly hears, in the creepiest voice you could probably ever imagine, saying, "Hey, I'm gonna kill you." While saying this, the man ran. She believes what to be a knife along the tent. She could hear him walking and dragging the knife. She was literally frozen. She couldn't say anything or even move. With her mouth agape, she finally snapped out of it and screamed, "Jim, grab your shotgun, kill him quick." With that, my dad woke up abruptly. They heard the snapping of twigs and footsteps, and they heard the guy running away. Now of course they didn't have a shotgun, they were only bluffing to try and scare this guy off. The fact that it worked though is amazing. My dad got up seconds later and began to run after him, but he was long gone. After that, my parents decided they were getting the hell out of there before anything else happened. They then went back up to my dad's truck only to find that the tyres were slashed. They're in the middle of nowhere with no way out and some maniac was trying to kill them. They actually tried blowing up their tyres with one of those things you use to blow up rafts. Obviously it didn't work. They had to try though, right? So about an hour or so later of being terrified, a ranger that was patrolling the area come along to help them out. He brought them back to town so they could fix their tyres. While talking to the ranger, they found out that they had been searching for any weird activity due to a recent murder nearby. My parents were very likely to be the next murderer's victims. This happened to myself and a close friend just last month. We decided to go on a 2-night backpacking/camping trip in the Adirondack Mountains of New York. We're both very comfortable with nature and spent a lot of time camping, hunting, fishing, etc. We hiked about 5 miles into a small lake and set up camp on a small beach. This was not a heavily trafficked area and we didn't expect to run into anyone. So on our first night we were just sitting around a campfire. We suddenly saw a flashlight moving on the other side of the lake at around 10:30. This was fairly unusual, however, we didn't think much of it. But as time went on, the flashlight kept moving around the lake and it kept on getting closer and closer to our campsite. We kept discussing who could possibly be wandering around the woods in the middle of the night, and we didn't particularly want to see any unwelcome guests. One thing was clear though, the person or people were heading for our campsite. We then moved and wandered off into the woods to try and figure out just who or what was coming up towards us. I took a small axe with me and had a .22 rifle. Now we weren't expecting trouble and we certainly didn't want to make any, but we figured that we might as well cover our base. Now, moment of truth, the flashlights come near the light of our fire and it's one man. He has a beard and is probably in his 40s. The scary part was that he was carrying what appeared to be a pump-action shotgun. He walked around the campsite a few times, then proceeded to enter our tent. After rummaging around for a minute or so, he come out yelling, "I know you're out here, why don't you come and say hello?" My friend and I remained motionless under a hemlock tree about 50 yards away. That's when the man proceeded to fire his shotgun into the woods, not too far from where we were, and he swung around his flashlight several times. Now after what felt like hours, he grabbed my friend's backpack and a few articles of clothing we had drying off near the campfire and threw them in to burn. Now my friend, who trained the 22 at the man, asked me if I should shoot. I told him absolutely not unless he points a shotgun towards our direction and spots us. Thankfully, that man moved away from where the camp was after a little while. We waited until his flashlight was on the other side of the lake again. We then ran out, grabbed everything we could fit into my backpack and took off. We ran on the trail with the flashlights and made it back to my car as the sun was coming up. We immediately told the police department about what had happened and reported it, where we then spoke with some forest rangers, and that was it. I have never heard anything back from the police. It wasn't a mysterious case, but it creeped the hell out of both of us.
Hello. I have an encounter you may or may not be interested in. My background. I'm 43 years old, a combat veteran from Operation Iraqi Freedom 2003 to 2005. I have 10 years service in the Army. I've been an avid hunter from age of 7 years old. My encounter took place in Fayette County, West Virginia, not too far from my house in an area called Cotton Hill, located where the New and Gully Rivers meet. It was November 1996, rifle season for antlered deer. Myself, my wife, and uncle were at a camp and we were sitting on the campfire when on the ridge above us was a loud, guttural growl, unlike anything I've ever heard in those woods. It lasted about 4 to 5 seconds. I might add that during the day, while hunting, it was like all the deer that had been there all disappeared. It seemed like there was no sign of them. We never saw what made that noise, but it made the hair stand up on the back of my neck. And I haven't let me stop enjoying the outdoors though, but let's just say, I'm more aware and prepared when I go out into the woods.
The following account occurred roughly 3 years ago during the summer of 2012. It's always been difficult for me to talk about this, but I found that writing it out and sharing it was somewhat therapeutical. I was 17 at the time and I'd gotten my first job. I lived in rural Western Virginia in a small mountain community. My mum's friend owned a camping resort not far from a house that had a general store, and she said she'd pay for me to help out in the store during the busy months in the summer. It was a pretty easy job, and I met a lot of out-of-towners, which was nice because our community could get so isolated. Most of us just lived really far apart from each other. So one day, a big burly mountain man came into the store. He was in his late 40s or early 50s. He was 6'5" and about 280 pounds. He looked dirty. Looked like he worked outside a lot. His clothes were sort of in tatters and he had a long beard. We had a few of these woodsy hermits type in the area, and this definitely looked like one of them. He bought some basic items, one of which was one of our homemade bars of soap. When he came to the register, he looked me up and down carefully. Didn't even talk for a minute, just stared. His people skills clearly needed work. "Did you make this soap?" he asked me. "Possibly. I've helped out with that sometimes." "You make a lot of your own stuff?" "Yeah, toiletries and stuff like that, yeah." "I like that," he said, nodding to himself. I honestly did not know how to respond. I quickly rang up his items and he paid with some crumpled up money. Before he left, he said, "You cook too?" Sometimes," I replied. "Bet the boys around here are itching to marry you," he said as he smiled to himself. I said nothing. I was puzzled as to what I'd said that stood out to make me wife material. I told Christine, who was my mum's friend and the boss, about the bizarre encounter and she laughed it off. So did my family and friends. But then, Mountain Man started turning up more often. We had chatted a little bit here and there, and I found out that he had a cabin in the woods. He claimed he built it with his bare hands. He said he hunted and lived off of the land. Now over time our chat escalated. He started telling me about how that I looked so nice and how it would be so nice to have a woman to be around that could make those things and cook. One time, he even said I had the birthing hips that men lust for. He even started inviting me to fish with him, hunt with him, see his place, etc., and I always politely declined. But he got more and more insistent, and I told Christine about how uncomfortable he was starting to make me. The intensity to which he said these things really scared me. Christine then said that when he come in, she would go and ring him up. Thanks to her, I started talking to him less and less. I thought it wouldn't have been a bad idea to not talk to him at all anymore, but one night I was closing off and it was late, around 10 PM. Christina had left about half an hour ago, and I was leaving by myself. The only two cars in front of the store were an old blue pickup and mine. I was immediately alarmed because I knew Mountain Man drove a blue pickup, but I didn't see him a lot. I just saw his car, so I walked out quickly to my car and checked the back seat before I started it up. But just then, when I first turned the key into the ignition, I got nothing but splutters. I tried several times and got scared quickly. Of all nights, why was this happening tonight? I remembered asking myself angrily. Just as I was reaching for my phone to call for help, there was a loud pounding on the driver's side window. I'm shocked that I didn't wee myself. I didn't even want to look because it was him, I knew it, but I did. My suspicions were confirmed. He had this huge stupid smile across his face and I could see exactly which one of his teeth were missing. Need some help? He said loudly through the window. I shook my head furiously. My dad is on his way, I said, hoping to scare him off. I hadn't spoken to my dad in years. Mountain Man laughed. No, he's not. I opened the door. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. How did he know I was bluffing? No, leave me alone, I said firmly and tried to sound angry. He then pulled the handle, but I had the doors locked when I first got in. He kept furiously pulling the handle and started pounding on the window. Leave now or I'm calling the cops, I screamed at him. He clearly wasn't getting the message, so I pulled out my phone and called 911. I must have sounded hysterical to the dispatcher, as I knew that she could hear him pounding too. She said that she would have officers out there ASAP, but they could be a while. The cops are on their way now, leave me alone, I screamed at Mountain Man, who didn't seem to let that deter him, but after a few more minutes of pounding, he suddenly stopped and walked towards his truck. I watched him go. Hopefully he would leave me alone, but no. This time he come back with a crowbar in his hand. No, I screamed at him, get away from me. He started swinging at the driver's side window with the crowbar. I ducked down into the passenger seat on the floor and covered the back of my neck, almost like you get taught to in tornado drills. I heard the sickening crack of the window, but not for long. Suddenly I heard male voices shouting, telling Mountain Man to get away from the car. I stand up and see two men approaching, one with a shotgun pointed at Mountain Man. I recognise them as a couple of guests staying at the resort for a camping trip. I breathed a sigh of relief and got out of the car, telling them that the police were on their way. I then thanked them profusely and waited for the police. Surprisingly, Mountain Man didn't make any moves to get away, but the cops come pretty quickly after that, so he didn't have much of a chance. They then took him away and I gave them my statement. I was pretty shaken up for a while afterwards. A few weeks later I finally got the scope on the man. Apparently he had a history of mental illness. He'd been in and out of the state institutions. He really had been living in an old cabin in the woods, where he wasn't taking his meds and had an issue that was only getting worse. When I was around 12 years old, I spent the afternoon at a friend's house who I knew from high school. He lived in a neighbourhood that I wasn't all that familiar with, so when we decided to take our bikes out for a ride, I simply followed him until we come to a large wooded area. It was in a valley that descended away from the roadside and from what I could see, become rather dense and overgrown quite quickly. Because of all the foliage, we decided to leave our bikes and go on foot. We had been hiking for about 20 minutes when we realised that we could no longer see the spot where we had left our bikes, and we were literally surrounded on every side by thick vegetation. Being boys, We thought this was absolutely fantastic and decided to carry on further into the valley. At some point, we come across what looked like to be a large abandoned campsite. There were some old cans laying around that looked like they'd been there and used to boil water, an old ashtray fire pit, and quite a lot of plastic sheeting. We had a look around but didn't really find anything interesting, so decided to carry on with our hike. Just as we're leaving, somebody called out to us from somewhere on the other side of the camp. A homeless man then appeared. No doubt the camp dweller then demanded to know what we were doing with his things. We explained that we weren't taking anything, we're just looking around, and he immediately calmed down. We made polite conversation for a few minutes, exchanged names, and gave a vague idea of where he'd come from. At this point, we didn't really feel like we were in any danger with the homeless guy, who was actually quite friendly. We then decided to say our goodbyes, but he told us that we had to give him something before we went. Now, we hadn't brought any food or water with us, so didn't even have anything to offer him, and apparently he took exception to this. He started yelling at us and demanded our shoes, which neither of us were willing to part with. We then started to try and slowly back away from him when he suddenly pulled out a knife and started running towards us. I don't remember exactly which way he went for us or how far we had to run, as I was so terrified and full of adrenaline. I did look back a few times and realised that we were in fact getting away from him, but he was still chasing us even though there was no cover from the trees at this point. We reached the side of the road where we'd left our bikes and fortunately had enough of a lead on him so that way we could hop on and pedal away from him. A couple of builders who were unloading materials up the road saw that we were panicked and stopped us to find out what was going on. We gave them a brief version of the events and they went back to see if he was still lurking around, but apparently he was long gone. My friend told his folks what happened that day, but we never heard any more about it. As far as I know, he could still be living at the campsite, but I certainly wasn't going to find out for myself. My dad was a journalist for most of his life. He's now an author. This is one of his stories from hiking the Appalachian Trail. My dad hiked the trail mostly by himself, but occasionally would run into other hikers and spend a few days hiking and camping with them. He said it was always a pleasant experience and he made a lot of really good friends out of it. On one of these such trails, he met Jeff and Molly, a really nice couple, and he began hiking with them for a couple of days. After camping with them and becoming fairly good friends, they went their separate ways and my dad pulled ahead of them. He was about 2 days further down the trail than them, and when he stopped at a town to get some food and relax, that's when he found out that Jeff and Molly had been murdered in their sleep by a stranger on the trail. They had both been either stabbed or shot. It's absolutely terrifying to think that my dad had literally camped with them days prior.
My boyfriend and I are a young couple in their mid-college years. We decided that we wanted to get away from work and our studies for the weekend, so we took a trip to the nearest hiking trail that is a part of the Appalachian Trail. We decided to leave on a Friday once I got off work and back up the trail in order to camp. I work in a restaurant and it's very difficult to set a time on when I'm going to leave work. I ended up leaving work around 4, but we said that no matter what, we would be going on this trip, and we finally left for the trail. We began hiking around 5:30. My boyfriend was an Eagle Scout, so we had all the necessary supplies for a successful camping trip. A tent, sleeping pads, pots, pans, stove, clothes, food, and of course, necessary substances to free our minds after the long hike. The first part of the hike was absolutely exhausting. It was all uphill, and we were both carrying at least 40 pounds in our metal framed backpacks. An hour later, we finally passed the first shelter. If not many of you know, a shelter on this trail is about 10 foot by 15 foot, approximately, log cabin that only has 3 walls, and is open to the outside. It's specifically used as a shelter to sleep in or hide from the rain. Midway through the hike, it began to pour dramatically in the forest. Sooner or later, we were both soaked from head to toe. Thick fog grew quickly, as it had been hot and humid Friday. The trail became very slippery, and our pace slowed down tremendously. We had hoped that we were getting closer to the camping site, but it turned very dark very quickly. We took a rest in the dark as it poured on us, in hopes that we would find our headlamps. Once we found our headlamps, we placed them on our heads, still struggling to balance ourselves on top of the rocky and muddy path. I thought by that point we would never make it to our shelter. We walked, never giving up, although I wanted to. As my socks and shoes were wet, I was tired, hungry, drenched, and cold. The temperature has dropped more than 25 degrees as we made our way up. It was 8:30 when we finally made it through to the second shelter in campgrounds. There was a split in the path. Either you could walk straight to continue to the top of the view, which was about 1.5 miles away, or you could turn slightly to the right and walk to the campgrounds. Or you could take a 90-degree turn to the right, walk down to the shelter. At that point, we were drenched from head to toe and needed to dry off. It was still raining to beat the band, so it would have been nearly impossible to set up our tent and camp. We had decided to stay put at the shelter until the rain calmed down. We didn't hear anyone out the shelter, so I was extremely excited to have the place to ourselves and take a few tokes, if you know what I mean. After our hike, I was dead set on it. Once we walked down to the shelter and got to the opening, there was a man and a woman in their 60s. We instantly thought to ourselves that they were an older married couple who wanted to get away for the weekend too. We told them that we wouldn't be bothering them for long, so we wet our backpacks down and attempted to dry off. The couple was very welcoming with a lantern and an absorbing towel for me to dry off in. My boyfriend and I took off our shirts since they were both carrying a lot of weight and water. The couple seemed to be very normal. The man brought a cute dog with him that I enjoy playing with. We began introducing ourselves with our names, where we were from, and what we were doing there. They both said they were in their 60s. Their names were Joe and Maya, and they were just messing around for the weekend. In between sentences, they were taking large gulps of what looked like to be alcohol in their water pack. They said they were just having fun and met online, which veered off into dropping hints that they were on a trail having an affair. The older woman, who says that she comes from West Virginia, struck me to be very off. It began with her looks, having scraggly, shoulder-length gray hair, with circular glasses resting on her face. Her teeth were very dark, nearly covered with a brown film, as if she used hard drugs in the past. She wore a pullover, hiking boots, and jean shorts that nearly exposed everything. Joe, on the other hand, was just an average white male, who had gray hair, and was a tad overweight. They spoke about their past employments and what they had done in life. Maya said she was a writer, which I admired. Information about ourselves was exchanged too, since they seemed very friendly. I was in a very bad mood though, and very irritable until I smoked some. My boyfriend and I periodically showed each other our phones in order to communicate, as we didn't have a bit of service in the shelter we were at. We agreed that it was okay if we started smoking, since they were becoming drunk. They said they didn't mind, but would like to join. I thought it was absolutely insane that they wanted to smoke at that age. The man only took 2 hits, but the woman took many. She was struggling a lot to even flick the lighter. The guys began their own conversation, and the woman and I veered off on ours as well. The woman began with asking me to tell her a story. As she inched closer and closer to me, she asked me to tell her a story. She grew more and more demanding, saying,
"Tell me a story."
My boyfriend and I met online, just as they said they did. So I was going to tell her about the story of how we met. I began the story with, "So you met him online, right?" The woman nearly cuts me off and angrily says, "What? Why would you say that?" I said to her, "You all met online, right?" She nearly cuts me off again and more aggressively says, "Why would you say that?" I said again, "Earlier Joe said you met online, didn't you?" She nearly shouts and growls,
"Why would you say that?"
I wanted to jump away from the conversation. So I asked her, "Well, you're a writer, you said, right? So why don't you tell me one of your best stories?" The woman becomes happy and giggly again. and while swirling her hands around in her head of hair, she said, "Well, I'm a writer in my mind." I was extremely confused and creeped out. I didn't know what to say. I'm the type of person to laugh it off, so that's what I did. She just said she enjoyed being a writer in her mind. I looked over at my boyfriend and Joe's conversation, and it seemed to be as normal as can be. There was absolutely nothing wrong about it, but Maya nearly gave me the chills as she got my attention, getting closer into my face, asking me what I was saying. The problem was that I wasn't saying anything. I was absolutely silent, ignoring her. She began talking to herself. She would make very in-depth hand gestures as she spoke to herself, then would ask me what I was saying to her. I wasn't saying a word, and she would wonder what I was telling her. She would abruptly say, "Yes, no, maybe, no way, yeah, it can't, wait, huh?" As she would rock back and forth, waving her arms around. She began crossing her legs, holding her arms up in the air, above her head. She started to shout,
"Coming out, I'm calling out to all of you, come."
She was nearly talking gibberish. The older man's attention was caught and asked her what in the world she was doing. She said, "I'm calling out, it's witchcraft." I was nearly high and terrified of all my surroundings. It stormed pretty badly in the background and it was black all around us. A small lamplight rested on a beam above our heads in the middle of the wooden shelter. I was wet and very vulnerable. Everything slowly began to get worse that night. Maya kept slurring her words, and the man demanded she get into her sleeping bag and sleep. I sat against the wall next to my boyfriend very closely, as the man crawled into his sleeping bag, and Maya attempted to put her legs in the sleeping bag, but couldn't. She moved around for a very long time, and finally curled up next to Joe, on top of her sleeping bag. She was probably freezing, as it was 35 degrees by 9:30. Only a few minutes passed, and we heard Maya whisper. Maya said angrily, "What did you give me?" She growls again, "What did you give me?" The man finally woke up and demanded, "What?" Maya hits him on his back and yells, "What did you give me?" She jumped up immediately facing us. Her eyes were nearly all black, as her pupils were so enlarged. She looked nearly sadistic and yelled at us, "What did he give me?" My boyfriend and I both tensed up, nearly losing our shit. She screams again, "What did he give me?" even louder, as her voice screeched into my eardrums. She once again turned around to the man, laying down behind him. She slowly whispered into his ear, softly growling, "Did you give me acid?" It began to run through my mind that he drugged her, or she was having a flashback of a bad trip. Joe attempted to calm her down, but she was still restless. She laid down for approximately 5 minutes, but Maya immediately sat up. She faced us with her legs crossed, and she stared at us, without breaking contact for at least 5 minutes. She did this every so often, sitting up, staring at us, and laying back down. She would do this over and over again, so we decided to leave immediately. We finally made our way out as she stared at us for one last time. We pitched camp as far away as possible, but I remained sleepless that night in fear Maya would find our tent and crawl into it.
"20 years ago, when my dad was younger, he used to live on a big farmhouse that was supposedly haunted. The house was hundreds of years old. On one Christmas Eve, his mum and my dad, who lived alone, could see that there was a weird light coming from the shed all the way down the end of the garden. Now, nobody should have been in there. My grandma always told my dad to never ever go down there. Well, that was up until this point. So my dad put on his coat and, very paranoid, stepped out to go and investigate what was going on. The closer he got, the stronger the smell of cigarette smoke became apparent. He was sure that there was some teenager in there messing with him. He went round to the back way and peered through the window. As he did so, the light instantly went out. This was simultaneous with the smell of smoke. This was more than enough to scare him into literally sprinting back to the farmhouse. As he got back there, my grandma slammed the door open, quickly ushered him inside and slammed it shut again. She said, "Don't worry, I've already called the fire department, they're on their way now." Confused as anything, my dad then asked my grandma what she was talking about. She said, "Look, the fire, you were right next to it." To my dad's horror, as he turned he could see that the shed was in a full blaze. It couldn't have been possible because my dad was only there seconds prior, and whatever that light was long gone, and the smell of the smoke. He didn't even get time to tell my grandma about it. To this day, he says he knows there's only one explanation to as what started that fire. Thank you for watching. Me and SwampDweller have done another video on his channel. It's soon to be uploaded, so make sure you check out the link in the description for when that comes out. Again, thank you to SwampDweller for featuring on this video. Make sure you guys go and check out his channel and his videos. I'm sure you're really going to like his content, and he's a really good guy. Thank you again, buddy, for working on this video. I'm looking forward to working with you again in the future. And for my fans, there's going to be a lot more videos coming this week, so make sure you stay tuned for that. I hope you're all well. Take care.